That quote is from an article describing an ESL student. What does ESL mean? ESL means English as a second language. That sentence uses the word ESL, but it can easily be exchanged with the word deaf, and it will still represent similar experiences and will still have the same meaning.
The three of us are studying ASL and deaf culture here at Penn. My name is Melanie.
My name is Laura.
My name is Jacob.
What are we discussing today? We're comparing the experiences of deaf students in the mainstream and ESL students in the mainstream and how they're parallel.
We want to start a conversation about their experiences inside the educational system and how that can reveal important ideas about education and society in general.
We're going to talk about deaf students and the law. There are two main important laws that deal with deaf students in education. The first law is the No Child Left Behind Act. Which is abbreviated NCLB. The second law is the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Which is abbreviated IDEA or IDEA. So IDEA, what is it? What is the concept of it? IDEA was first passed in Congress in 1975. It required that all students with disabilities up to age 21 must be provided with free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment with accommodations. It's important to keep the least restrictive environment phrase in the back of your head because it will become important later on in the presentation. IDEA. What does it specifically do? States and educational institutions are provided with funds and are required to do four main things. The first thing is to provide full educational opportunities. The second is to identify who needs these services. The third is to ensure that teachers are highly qualified. And the fourth, develop individualized educational plans for each and all students. Now, there's an even bigger problem with the deaf community. When you look at this phrase, you see least restrictive environment. This phrase is interpreted badly inside the law. This is because one size does not fit all. By that, the least restrictive environment is interpreted in the law as being only found in mainstream school settings. That concept is bad for deaf children specifically. This is because mainstream schools provide less communication and less educational opportunities. In order to have more educational opportunities, we need more communication. But now what can we do? We really need to first inform ourselves about the issue and then start to inform other people. We need to always try to start a conversation.
Experiences of deaf students. When the law changes, both home life and academic life change. So how does this affect life at home? If the law supports sign language, schools tend to support sign language. Then, at home, parents tend to help their children learn sign language, so parents know how to sign. Ultimately, students acquire language. They communicate better. But when law supports different forms of communication, such as oralism or manually coded signs, schools tend to support those, and parents tend to emphasize that with their children. Ultimately, communication breaks down because it's not a language. At school, their lives are impacted both socially and academically. Academically, the ability to do well depends on the ability to communicate well. There's a variation. If the school promotes sign language, they tend to do better. When deciding between a hearing school or a deaf school, which one's better academically, it really depends on how well they communicate. In mainstream schools, students tend to do better because of more challenging courses and a more variety of choices of courses to pick from. But again, this depends on communication. If the school promotes oralism or some other form of communication, it's a lot harder because communication breaks down. But in deaf schools, schoolwork might not be as academically challenging, but if communication's better, they might do better. Which type of school is better for social life? Again, communication is key. In mainstream schools, deaf students tend to feel isolated because they can't communicate well with other students. But in deaf schools, students tend to feel like they belong because they can communicate in sign. So now my question is, why do you need to choose between better academics and a healthy social life?
The identity of the deaf community has many characteristics. One way of describing that community is as a language minority group. Most of the deaf community uses ASL, but most of America uses English. In the context of education, it's possible to compare deaf students in the mainstream with ESL students. ESL means English as a second language. Within the educational system, both of these communities are considered minority groups. They're looked down upon and considered to be disabled. One interesting example of this comparison comes from an international student from Japan who went to school in Canada. One day, she was sitting working in a classroom, and another student outside the room knocked on the door and said, "Could you open the door?" The girl remembered, "Oh, my teacher told me I shouldn't open the door for anyone." So she continued to work and ignored the boy's request. The other student got angry and knocked on the door and screamed, "Are you deaf or ESL?" It's interesting that some ESL students really have experience with that comparison between them and deaf students. Normally, in the case of both deaf students and ESL students, neither of them really have a voice or have the power to control their own educations. Both communities often struggle in the mainstream. It's difficult for them to adapt to their school environments if the schools are unwilling to adapt to their own needs. It's hard for them to learn if teachers think that they're not smart just because they're not skilled at English. Some ESL students say that teachers should be more patient and understand that ESL students may learn in a different way, but they still can learn. That struggle to learn from spoken English shows up in the deaf community as well. Another problem is that ESL students often feel isolated. They think that if they don't have proficient English skills, they won't be able to make new friends. One international student from Japan said that in all her years of schooling, she never had one friend. Often, the concept of ESL is defined in terms of a deficiency or a lack of a certain skill. The same happens with the concept of deafness. People often look down on the deaf community and think that deafness is only a disability. These two communities have strong parallels in their experiences. In a similar vein, the word deaf can be a descriptor, but it can also be seen as part of the social institution which describes the concept of disability. The common perspective of the majority is that both ESL and deaf communities need help and assistance and may be disabled simply because they don't use spoken English.
When you compare deaf student mainstream and ESL student mainstream, you learn a lot about the educational system. Normally, if a student is smart, they usually have a skilled language. People usually think that if you're smart, you know a language. If you don't know a language, then people usually think you failed. That perspective is not right. Yet it happens again and again in the educational system. Also, there are many other barriers that schools face, and it's not just language alone. Yes, it is hard to learn new information, but it's also hard to make a new friend. It's important to realize that there's a relationship between both of those factors.
So what have we learned about society? Deaf students in the mainstream and ESL students in the mainstream have similar experiences, but they're not the same. All students have a variation in their experiences, and you can't support different minority groups the exact same way. An important concept to understand is that the label of minority is not an intrinsic quality of that minority group, but instead a name given to them by society. All groups have the possibility of becoming minority groups based on society's perspective.
Now, what about society needs to change? The first thing is that there should be increased communication with students. Educators should ask them, what do they need and how can they be supported? The second thing is that the educational system is not flexible. It expects students to adapt to their school environments. But schools really have a responsibility to support their own students. Schools must be the ones to fit to the needs of the students, not the other way around. Lastly, people tend to assume that the deaf community has only one singular identity. They're a disability community, or a language minority group, or an ethnic group. But really, the identity of the deaf community can mean many things. It can be described in many different ways. Society must respect the fact that the deaf identity is very complex and has many different parts. We hope you've learned something today about mainstreamed experiences and that you'll want to continue this conversation in the future about the educational system.
Thank you.